Everybody builds their Jeep differently, and I have the utmost respect for however you want to do it. Your money, your Jeep, your decisions. I support you. And that's what makes the Jeep community so great. But here at SFJ 4x4, we build Jeeps for work, for daily driving, for the streets to the trails. We have proven experience that certain things work and certain things only are in the eye of the beholder. We want to prioritize modifications that promote reliability and functionality without wasting people's money in the process. So this is just our hot take based on years and years of real world experience. My name is Neil with SFJ 4x4 Simpson Family Jeeps, and I'm going to tell you there's some stuff in here for new Jeepers, there's some stuff in here for old Jeepers, while we unpack the top 5 modifications that are still done to this day that, quite frankly, we're not interested in doing professionally for our customers. In no particular order, the first item on my list, and this one is for our restorationists, our iconic vintage Jeep enthusiasts. This one might sting a little bit, but I absolutely cannot and will not prioritize or recommend fiberglass Jeep body swaps. I know. Oh my gosh, you are rolling over some of our vintage enthusiasts. Settle. It's not to say that there wasn't a place for fiberglass bodies. There was. And I appreciate how the fiberglass race to salvage and save an entire era of Jeeps, it has created the iconic nature of the CJ. I have all the utmost respect for the numerous different manufacturers and individuals who literally put their life on the line working with fiberglass and understanding how to form and shape Jeep bodies so that we can still enjoy those vehicles today. From years of working with the myriad of fiberglass tubs and body parts for these iconic vintage Jeep models, specifically the CJs, I can tell you that there is a lot of imperfections and learning curves, despite the fact that the Jeep will not technically rust away where they once did. Now, go back, way back in your time machine, kind of think that you yourself are a Jeep owner in the 80s and the 90s, and you have this vintage CJ Jeep that ultimately the bodies are completely deteriorating on. Now, this was a massive faux pas on behalf of the mothership manufacturer because, quite frankly, the bodies were impure and the paint and the coating process was not necessarily ideal. And so if you found yourself, unfortunately, in the Rust Belt, the body deteriorated exceptionally quick when it came to rust in all the different places. So realistically, there was a huge movement from coast to coast of individuals trying to salvage the drivetrain and the frames of these Jeeps long before they were destined for the boneyard. So fiberglass tubs seemed like a relatively successful pursuit. Now, with that said, there's a huge challenge because, quite frankly, when you make an aftermarket tub or body component, and this even goes to today's issues, they are typically made off of 1 or 2 test mules. Prototype vehicles or prototype parts are made on a vehicle that the company owns. So if that company's frame for these tubs that were built many, many years ago was just a little bit out of skew, then that means that all of the fiberglass tubs that came out of that mold were also just a little out of skew. Not to mention a complete lack of access to electrical grounds. There are so many things on the Jeep CJ that require grounding, and it was originally done from the factory via just grounding to the dash, because the dash was metal, the body was metal, and it was connected to the frame via metal bolts. And so if you had grounding straps at the body and on the frame and on the engine, quite frankly, the vehicle was grounded. As soon as you start to put fiberglass components into the mix, access to grounds diminishes and electrical gremlins start to explode all over the scene. Quite frankly, performing a restoration professionally using a fiberglass tub is not in the best interest of our business. Now, that's not to say that the aftermarket steel bodies by today's standards are perfect. They're absolutely not. I can promise you that. But they do inherently have advantages over those fiberglass bodies that once saturated the market. I still have a deep-seated appreciation, and if you approach me at the show and you have a fiberglass tub on your Jeep, I'm going to be excited for you. But realistically, it's not something that we are going to encourage you to do in your process of paying for a professional restoration. Number 2, and this is going to touch a number of people, fun-colored or multicolored flashy headlights. I know, they look cool. They're fun. When it gets dark out or you want to do a parade or you're sitting at the meet and greet, you can pull up an app on your phone and you can change the color and you make them blink and you can do all that kind of stuff. That is super cool. I get it. But if you're going to come to us professionally and say, I would like quality headlights because I feel like I can't see in the dark, I'm not going to recommend RGB, color changing, flashing headlights. Now, realistically, there are performance headlights in the aftermarket and there are fun-colored headlights. There is yet to be a manufacturer who appropriately crosses the two into one. Rarely does a fun-colored headlight, and again, that's the one that has a halo or background lights that kind of, can blink and change and all that kind of stuff. Rarely do they actually have the focus and the light output and the light intensity that a performance-driven headlight would have. But all of those manufacturers of quality headlights, none of them actually make a fun color-changing headlight. Why that is, I'm not actually a lighting expert. What I can share with you is our professional experience with many, many, many years of hands-on experience. Now, typically those fun-colored LED chip-driven headlights are manufactured overseas in such a way that performance-driven lighting isn't the priority. The priority is the fun color changing or the app interface. So typically speaking, we run into loose wiring connections, poor integration of the drivers that help the plug-and-play nature of that light receiving its electrical power to its output, so making it easy for you to DIY install them. We run into issues where the light itself might be constructed poorly, and therefore when you do follow the instructions, you're actually tapping into part of the Jeep that does not appropriately support that lighting function. And so it actually causes other issues within the back end of the Jeep's thought processes. Now, that's not to say that a specific check engine light is going to plague you or be a problem, but you should know that if you do choose to do those fun multicolored headlights, they typically will throw a code in the background of your Jeep. Now, again, the check engine light doesn't turn on, but when you run a scan of the system, it is there. Now, typically, those performance-driven headlights have a better installation and oftentimes do not specifically alert the vehicle that there's a voltage difference or some type of other wiring or communication issue that may be present in a background code. Now, that's not to say those background codes are the big reason we won't do it, but more so, lighting output and longevity are the reasons why we typically try to steer people towards performance-driven headlights versus the fun multicolor ones. Realistically, when it comes to lighting, you get what you pay for. And if you're specifically shopping on a budget and you want fun multicolored lights, don't expect to get very much lifespan out of them. They're just flat out not going to work very well, or you're going to have to fiddle and monkey and maintenance them pretty often. Now, there's always an exception to the rule. I understand you might be watching this and being like, mine have been great for 3 years. Cool. Good for you. But the vast majority of people do not have the utmost positive experience with fun multicolor headlights. Instead, they typically have to go through some type of warranty process, or the app will fail and you'll have to get something new. Or in worst case scenarios, the headlights will simply become obsolete and you'll be stuck with one working and one not, and you'll have to go out and buy a whole new pair of fun multicolor lights. So if a person is wanting a headlight upgrade, we're steering them towards performance and not necessarily to the RGB fun app controlled stuff. It just is what it is. I want your money to be worthwhile to you and not necessarily thrown down the pot into the vast abyss of the internet. Now, when making this video, I didn't think that I was going to make a ton of friends, because there's things included in this list that are talked about every day on the social pages and in the forums, and in general are just kind of ingrained in the lifeblood of the Jeep culture. But this one is definitely going to speak to a number of hardcore Jeep enthusiasts, and certainly if you're an off-roader. But number 3 on my list of modifications that I just flat out won't do for a customer are junkyard axle builds. Now, I say that, I exclude the Ford 8.8 swap into a small body Jeep from this conversation. And I specifically focus in on tons and Dana 44 axle swaps. They're not cost effective. That is the flat out primary reason why I'm going to say we're not going to do this for individuals coming to us. Now, if you've already acquired the axle and you just want some parts installed into it, or it's already under your Jeep and it needs serviced, we're here to help you. But if you're an individual who comes in and says, I have this Jeep and I would like a Dana 60 out of an 80s Ford pickup truck, and I'd like a corporate 14 bolt installed in it, I'm going to attempt to dissuade you to the best of my ability. Now, that's based on what I will call the dollar for dollar value that you are getting. Junkyard axles make sense if you are the builder. You're sourcing all the parts and you're ensuring that everything fits and is functioning appropriately when you go out to use it. Otherwise, if you are an individual who's paying for that professional experience, then it is actually best left to a manufacturer who has already done all of that homework, research, and kind of fit and finish for you. Now, we have personally taken aftermarket axles, whether they be from Curry or Dana Spicer or Dynatrac, and we've cut brackets off of them, and we have refabricated brackets to install them into older Jeeps. That's perfectly okay. But when it comes to repurposing a full-size axle out of a different vehicle and then putting it under a Jeep, there are so many different types of junkyard axles. And so whether they came out of Jeeps originally or full-size trucks or a cabin chassis or vans, there's kind of sky's the limit when it comes to these different cool axles. But by today's standards, when people expect to drive their Jeeps to and from the trails, to and from the shows, they expect a particular degree of handling out of the vehicle. Things like caster to pinion angle, full-size width, kingpins, ball joints, small U-joint versus large U-joint, tone rings versus not. There's a huge swath of things to be considered when choosing the correct axle for use in a Jeep. Now, I personally built quite a few sets of junkyard axles before I threw in the towel and basically said, this is not a good option for our customers. Now, I mentioned that I exclude the Ford 8.8. the crossover between the 488 and the aftermarket support is so significant that, quite frankly, that one doesn't feel like a boneyard or junkyard axle build. Instead, I want to avoid situations like my own personal one where I sourced an 85 Ford F350 Dana 60 front Kingpin axle. It was an awesome axle. But here's the big issue. It had such a low caster rating that by the time that we positioned the axle so that it worked well in the Jeep, pinion to knuckle orientation, I actually only had 2 degrees of caster. Realistically, there's nothing that we could do about it. I know. You're sitting at home and you're like, well, I would have built it different and I would have turned the C's and da-da-da-da. That's cool. I appreciate that. But when you're figuring time and energy in the process, we don't actually have a great way to turn C's anymore as a society. The vast majority of people are not doing those technical pieces that the average consumer requires for them to continue to enjoy their Jeep. So because of low caster and kind of peculiar pinion to knuckle orientation, the sorted array of parts that need to be rebuilt or redone, because quite frankly, that axle had a life before it was in the Jeep, and you may need to rebuild a whole lot of it before it is good and functional. I don't recommend this swap for the average customer looking for tons or aftermarket axle options. Mod number 4, and I'm going a little throwback, a little old school for people, but you would be surprised at how many people still call and ask us to put a small block Chevy 350 in their Jeep. Now, I'm not discrediting the small block Chevy. I honestly try to avoid putting carbureted engines in Jeeps, period. I love retrofitting fuel injection into our vintage vehicles, but that's not necessarily for everyone, and we will work with carburation and we'll absolutely do engine swaps. But if you call with a Jeep that's been built since 86, 87 through today, and you ask us to swap in some form of old school carbureted engine, I'm flat out going to tell you we won't do it. Not because I don't think that you should do it, that's fine, but you're not getting the value for your dollar of having a professional shop do that kind of swap and for you to actually use the Jeep in the way that you think you would like to do it. But think about that time when a carbureted 350 was kind of king of the road. That is when we got the concept that 100,000 miles was a lot of miles on an engine. And I'm willing to bet that there are tens of thousands of people watching this video that have JKs and maybe even JLs that are well over 100,000 miles and they're working well. So think to yourself, there is a reason why we have advanced beyond the technology of carburation and of those small block engines. And again, I'm trashing the Chevy 350, but Ford folks, that's only because I'm giving you respite because I usually trash you. Realistically, it's any old school V8, V6 carbureted engine that you would like to stick in a new body Jeep. They flat out don't belong there. I'd rather address your Jeep in a comprehensive manner, ensuring that the components that were originally engineered to work well in there, that gave that Jeep 100, 150, 200,000 miles, that they're working to the best of their ability, and that you could probably and comfortably get another 50, 70, 100,000 miles out of that vehicle if appropriate repairs are done versus yanking the whole thing out and sticking in some old school technology just because in America we love our blown V8s. It's just not what we're going to do. Again, if that's what you want to do and you want to tinker away and you have a purpose for that build, God bless you. But realistically, we're not going to take your hard-earned money and do that modification in this situation. Last but not least, and this one's going to touch a number of people, overlanding rigs. That's right, you heard me, overlanders. Expensive camping. All right, that's kind of not true. What I am going to talk about when it comes to overlanding is inappropriate weight to power ratio. I know your eyes might have glazed over on that last statement and you're just stuck on the fact that I may have treaded onto this unholy ground of overlanding. But hear me out. Overlanding is super cool. It's fun. And quite frankly, I'm a little jealous of the time that these individuals get to spend on the road and in their Jeeps and exploring the vast wilderness and opportunities that your Jeep presents to you. But realistically, sometimes it's too easy to go onto Amazon or into the social groups or onto some, catalog and just pick out every single accessory that looks cool to you and start to affix it some way on your Jeep, without paying too much attention to the actual weight of the accessories or modifications and how they will affect the Jeep's performance from there. I think I see this most often in our JT Gladiator owners, but realistically, Wrangler Overlanders, you're not excused from this conversation either. Now, one of the things that when an individual calls in and they do a consultation with regearing or trying to kind of modify or build up their Jeep for overlanding purposes is how much gear have you added to the original equipment of the Jeep? This is an important conversation because just like an RV increases the payload capacity of the original chassis that the recreational vehicle is built upon, we have to take this into consideration when it comes to how many accessories you have added to your Jeep for then how you want to use it. So my statement about overlanding and modifications is specifically based on the weight of the vehicle to the utilization of it. And so overlanders, I will set you aside and say that folks who over armor and add tons of cages and off-road accessories until they've added thousands of pounds of extra weight to the vehicle, you are just as guilty in this conversation. And we will steer you clear of that when we're offering our services to you or you are soliciting them for payment. I want your money to be well spent and not necessarily in a situation where your vehicle is so heavy that it is bogged down and it is no longer able to feel peppy and spirited and, kind of mobile on those off-road trails. If it is lumbering and has a high center of gravity, you're simply not going to be able to do what that Jeep was originally built for and probably what attracted you to this platform in the first place. So overlanders as a whole, you're not the only people I'm speaking to, but realistically, when it comes to adding accessories, you have to be conscientious of how much horsepower and output power does the engine and the drive line have. What is your mechanical advantage through your axles? What kind of effect is this going to have on your suspension? Thankfully, there are a number of suspension manufacturers out there who are catering bigger, heavier springs specifically towards this issue, but it is a modification that needs to be delicately addressed that ensures that the Jeep remains functional and useful for you for the duration of your ownership. All right, folks, what'd you think about my 5 modifications that we won't do? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you have anything to add? Is there a particular modification that people are doing here and now that you wish that they would stop? We read and respond to the majority of comments left below. We want to hear from you. And as I said, make sure you like and subscribe and ring that bell. We upload as often as we possibly can. We want to build this, and with your help, it is absolutely happening. Thank you, YouTube Jeep family. Jeep on.